Hey guys, welcome to the Truth Tank. Chris Donasso here. Glad you could join me this week for this week's video. So I'm finishing up a series this week on the resurrection. And in my last video, we talked about the Gospels and we talked about some of the common objections and arguments that you might find from some of the skeptics and some of the critics. For example, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John really didn't write those Gospels. Even if they did, they were biased and they were pushing a religious agenda. We also talked about some of the alleged contradictions in the Gospels. So if you tend to believe those objections, I would encourage you to look back at my last video because I think I give some pretty sound arguments as to why I believe those objections are false. Also, if you haven't already, consider subscribing to my channel. I would really appreciate it. These videos are super time consuming. They really are, and I'm not really doing this for the money or anything like that. I have a full-time job. I'm doing this because I really believe that Jesus is who he said he was, and I believe that he did the things that the Bible said that he did. And I believe that he's in the business of changing lives. He changed my life. I think he could change yours. There's nothing weird about talking about this. It's good to talk about these things. It really boils down to truth and history. You know, did this really happen or not? Is this true or not? And I just want to kind of keep the conversation in front of you. So if you're a believer, I hope that these videos are encouraging you and strengthening you in your faith. And if you're not a believer, I hope that you're really wrestling with the reality that we have an extremely strong case historically for the resurrection of Jesus. So the point of this week's video is to talk about that ace that I mentioned in my last video. We've been dealt a hand of cards historically. And in the Gospels, we have a pretty strong hand, right? I mentioned that in Matthew and John, because they were eyewitnesses, we have a king, right? And in Mark, we have a queen. And at the very least, we have a Jack and Luke. Let's just put the Gospels aside for a second. Let's suppose that we don't even have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Would we still have evidence for the resurrection? And the answer to that is absolutely. In fact, the evidence outside the Gospels that we have in the New Testament are extraordinary. And it comes from an unexpected source. And that person is Saul of Tarsus, who we now know as the beloved Apostle Paul. So here's some things you need to know about Paul. His life story is truly extraordinary. Paul was a contemporary of Jesus. He was a brilliant mind in his day. If you don't believe me, just read the book of Romans. You'll find out very quickly that Paul was an extremely bright intellectual. Paul studied under Gamaliel. Gamaliel was a leading authority of the Sanhedrin. That was kind of the Jewish Supreme Court of the first century. And Gamaliel was a highly esteemed teacher of the Jewish law, kind of a doctor of Jewish law, if you will. And Paul was kind of this up-and-coming, emerging Jewish leader, and he was appointed to extinguish the church at that time. It was his assignment to eradicate this Christianity thing that was happening in the first century. So soon after the resurrection, Paul begins to persecute Christians. I mean, he's dragging them out of their house, throwing them in the streets, stoning people. I mean, we're talking about a murderous persecutor of the church. But then this crazy thing happens. Paul has this encounter on the road to Damascus with the risen Christ, and it radically transforms Paul's life. And after that, we find him giving up everything, turning from his old way of life, spending the rest of his days to his very last breath proclaiming that Jesus was the Son of God, that Jesus rose from the dead, that Jesus was who he said he was. And Paul experienced all kinds of persecutions for this. I mean, he was stoned for his faith. He was whipped for his faith. He was beaten and flogged. He was imprisoned. He was shipwrecked. I mean, preaching the gospel and the resurrection of Jesus came at a very high price for Paul. And in the end, he paid the ultimate price, being sentenced to death for his faith by Emperor Nero. So did Jesus really rise from the dead? Well, you can bet your life that Paul believed it, because Paul laid down his very life proclaiming this truth. So Paul goes from a persecutor of the church to a preacher, and then goes on to write much of the New Testament, like 2/3 of the New Testament. It's truly an amazing story. So what I want to do today is I want to trace the information that we can get from Paul as far back as we can to the actual event of the resurrection itself. Because it doesn't really matter how old the information is, right? I mean, if I was writing 2,000 years from now about the coronavirus, it doesn't matter that I'm writing 2,000 years later. What matters is my information aligns well with the most earliest information that we have about the coronavirus. That's what's important to historians, and that's what's critical to making a historical case for something being true. All right, so in terms of dates, everything, and I mean everything that I'm going to give you today, is accepted across the board by conservative scholars all the way to atheist scholars and the biggest critics of Christianity. They're all going to agree with what I'm going to share with you today. And if you're skeptical about that, just check it out for yourself. So listen to what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. This was written in about 55 AD. Paul says, "Now, brothers, I would remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and which you stand, and by which you are saved, if you hold fast to the words I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures." He goes on, "And then he appeared to Cephas," that is Peter, "and then to the 12, and then to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as one untimely born, he appeared also to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am." So Paul's saying here, he's saying, remember when I first met you. Remember what I said to you. Well, now I'm writing it down for you. All right, so when did Paul first meet with the Corinthians? Well, we're pretty certain about that date. It was around 52 AD. And we know that because the New Testament describes a city-state leader who oversaw Corinth at that particular time. And we know that those leaders only served one term. Well, guess what? Archaeologists have found an inscription with that guy's name on it. So we know for certain that he served from 51 to 52 AD. And so we know that that's when Paul was in Corinth. In fact, Gary Habermas, who's a leading New Testament scholar, he says that this is likely one of the most ascertained dates in all of the New Testament. So notice that Paul says that he received this information from someone else. Well, when did that happen? Well, we know that he received it about 35 AD, and I'm going to get into this more, but this is not debated by scholars. This is a consensus position that Paul first received this information in 35 AD. Well, what did Paul receive? Well, let's go back and look at verse 3. He says here, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received." that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. What Paul received was the most foundational core truths of Christianity, right? That Jesus died, he was buried, and that he raised. Now, here's what you need to know about Paul's words here in verses 3 and 4. This passage, verse 3 and following, is accepted by scholars to be an early creed of the early church. There's several of these in the New Testament, but these creeds are really important because they're kind of the bedrock truths that were established and communicated by the early church. And they were written and kind of packaged in such a way to make them easy to remember and easy to memorize, because remember, most of the people back then were illiterate. They couldn't read and write. Probably 90% of the people back then couldn't. So these were common proclamations that were being taught to the early church. So here we find Paul referencing this creed. So the question is, how far does that creed go back? Well, most scholars believe that it goes back very close to the death and the resurrection of Jesus. Get this, even critical scholars will say that they can trace these creeds back to just 2 to 3 years from Jesus' death and resurrection. Bart Ehrman, a leading scholar, one of the most noted and quoted voices on the New Testament, he's a critic of Christianity, an agnostic, an atheist. He would even say, yeah, I can't argue with that. This is historical. And so again, I can't emphasize enough that virtually all scholars, Christian or not, agree that this is a creedal passage, that it reflects the earliest preaching of the New Testament church, and it dates back just 2 to 3 years from Jesus' death and resurrection. This is pretty remarkable. So now the question is, where and when did Paul get this information? So we know that Paul wrote 1st and 2nd Corinthians. That's not disputed historically. We also know that Paul wrote Galatians. That also is not disputed historically. And from those writings, we can gather some additional facts that kind of give us the where and the when and answer some of those questions. So consider this timeline. Scholars would say that Jesus was crucified in 30 AD. Okay, this is like ground zero, right? We know that Paul was converted on the road to Damascus, and that happened around 33 AD, so plus 3. We know from Galatians that after Paul's conversion, he went back to Jerusalem to meet with Peter and James. This happened in 36 AD, so now we're plus 6. So how do we know this? Because, well, Paul tells us. Listen to what Paul says in Galatians 1. He says, "Then 3 years later, I went up to Jerusalem to become acquainted with Cephas." That's 3 years later after he converted. And he says he goes to Jerusalem to become acquainted with Cephas, which is Peter, and stayed with him for 15 days. "But I did not see any of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. Now what I'm writing to you, I assure you before God that I am not lying." Now what's important to note is that the verb used here in the Greek when it says to become acquainted with is the word historeo. And this is the word that we get our English word history. And here it means to find out, to obtain firsthand, to gain knowledge. And so check this out. So Paul's visit to Jerusalem is really a fact-finding mission. It was an investigation that he went on to meet with Peter and James and kind of swap notes on his experience with the risen Jesus versus their experience with the risen Jesus. So let's kind of keep going with our timeline. So then Paul says that 14 years later, he goes back to Jerusalem for a second meeting with the apostles. And he says that the purpose for this meeting is that he wouldn't run in vain, that he wouldn't be running in vain. In other words, he wanted to make sure that his message aligned with their message. And what we learned from that meeting is that the apostles fully accepted Paul. In fact, it says that they gave him the right hand of fellowship. In other words, hey, high five, Paul. We agree with everything you're saying. We give you full acceptance. And Paul says that they added nothing to him. So this happens around 50 AD. So now we're plus 20. So it's about 2 years later when Paul actually goes to preach in Corinth, 52 AD, plus 22 years. And then 3 years later, Paul writes this letter to the Corinthians, which was written in 55 AD, plus 25. Now let's go back to that early creed that we talked about in 1 Corinthians. Again, scholars believe that this creed dates back to 1 to 2 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. So it takes us right back, so close to the very time of the resurrection event itself. So you can't tell me, like some of my atheist friends tell me, that, this resurrection thing was just a legend that developed over time. No, legends take years, if not decades, to develop. So that's not an option because there's just not enough time that passed. And we know that this dates right back to the beginning. So here's the bottom line. The history that we have on the resurrection is like a tank. It is unstoppable. It's bulletproof. And let me leave you with this. No scholars in 2020 would disagree with what I'm about to tell you. Jesus' earliest followers had experiences that they thought were appearances of the risen Jesus. Well, maybe they were lying, or maybe they saw hallucinations. I would challenge you, in light of the history, to think about those objections, work through them, because we don't have time to do that right now, but you're going to realize very quickly that those objections just don't hold water. They're weak. They don't even make rational sense. So if Jesus really rose from the dead, and I would submit to you that he did, what does that mean for you? Think about it. All right, we'll see you next time. Thanks again for joining me and have a great week.